Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, some of the most game-changing, influential singers in hard rock and heavy metal. What inspired me to make this video was someone recently asked me, who are the guitar players who changed the way the guitar was played? And two guys came to my mind right away, Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen. Both of them, when they came out, they changed the way people played guitar. Jimi Hendrix with his use of feedback and effects and his level of technique. And then Eddie Van Halen, the same thing. Eddie Van Halen's two-handed tapping, his use of hammer-ons and pull-offs, his whammy bar harmonic dive bombs, his sound, his fast technique. These were all things that after these guitar players came out, a lot of guitar players felt like you had to have these techniques in your toolbox, in your arsenal. And I thought, who are the singers that are technique-changing, game-changing, influential singers who, when they came out, they changed the way people sang? Now, this was hard because there's a lot of great singers, and just because you're a great singer doesn't mean you changed the way, the technique of singing, so to speak. So, for instance, Phil Lynott. Phil Lynott is one of my favorite hard rock singers. I love Phil's voice, but did his singing style change the way people sang? Did he have some technique or way he sang that no one had ever heard before, and it just changed the way everybody sang after that? I would say no. Again, but I love Phil. Amazing voice. I love his voice and his lyrics and his phrasing and everything. And I also didn't want to include people who changed the way people wrote lyrics, for instance. For instance, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan changed the way people thought about writing lyrics. The Beatles did too at one point with Eleanor Rigby. Everybody was, including them, we're singing like love songs and Love Me Do and She Loves You before that. And then Eleanor Rigby came out and it changed the way people wrote lyrics in rock songs. So I didn't want to include lyricists. Maybe that'll be another video. So this was a hard list to make, and I feel like I probably left some people out. So I want people to help me out here, and you can leave down in the comments who you think are the game-changing, technique-changing singers. So, all right, the first guy that I thought of was Robert Plant. When Robert Plant came out on that first Led Zeppelin album, nobody was singing that high and that clean in that style. I mean, there were Motown singers that sang in their falsetto, and Smokey Robinson and things like that, but nobody was doing it in a rock and roll kind of way, where putting it in rock music, singing up high like that clean, high, wailing type of voice thing. And after Robert Plant, that became something that is just synonymous with rock singing. You know, rock singers wailing really up high in their range. Robert Plant, for me, was one of the first guys to do that, and thus he was highly influential and changed the way people sang after him. So, all right, that was my first one that came to my mind, was Robert Plant. Next would be, for me, Ian Gillan from Deep Purple. And I say Ian Gillan because Ian Gillan added those shrieks and screams that he did, those falsetto screams that he did. That was like a technique that, although Robert Plant was singing in a really high upper range, that sort of screaming, shrieking thing that Ian Gillan did was like a new technique that after Ian Gillan, a lot of hard rock and metal singers especially would add that to their arsenal, to their toolbox. So I put Ian Gillan as another guy who is a highly influential, sort of changed the way people sang because of that upper register scream that he had. I would maybe also include Steven Tyler in this because he had that element, like Ian Gillan, that upper falsetto, screamy type of thing, but he also had a gravelly, raspy, bluesy quality to his voice, and sort of combined all these things of Ian Gillan, Robert Plant, the big range, the upper screams, the bluesy, gravelly voice. So I would include Steven Tyler as a guy who, from a technique standpoint, changed the way singers after him sang. All right, I would also put Freddie Mercury. I almost didn't put Freddie Mercury on the list but when I really thought about it, I thought Freddie was a guy that, with his operatic style of singing, that he was one of the first, or definitely one of the most influential guys to do that, to add that as a singing style, that very big, very operatic. He also used his falsetto a lot, that sort of light, airy voice. So I would put Freddie Mercury in there too, for bringing the very open, big, operatic style of singing to hard rock. Then I would include, for the women, I know I made a list of, I think it was in my question and answer video where I listed my favorite rock singers, and somebody said, how come you don't have any women on your list? And so I would include Janis Joplin in here, for someone who changed the way women sang after her. Before Janis Joplin, you had bluesy singers like Aretha Franklin and the Motown singers, but they mostly sang in like a very clean style voice. Janis Joplin brought that whiskey-soaked, bluesy, gravelly vocal thing to women's singing. And then that became something that, after this, other female singers would incorporate into their technique, was, instead of just singing with a clean voice, having that raspy, gravelly quality to their voice. I might also include in this, and along the same line, is Rod Stewart, because Rod Stewart brought that technique of that sort of hoarse, raspy, whiskey-soaked barroom style voice, and that technique of singing. You know, Steven Tyler had some of that too, but I think Rod Stewart, he has that like just across his whole range. And you would hear singers after him like Bryan Adams or somebody like that, you know, that is a technique then that after Rod Stewart, a lot of people added to their singing. And it's something, and again, all these singers have traits that have now become, if you were to describe hard rock singing, high clean singing, Robert Plant; screams, Ian Gillan; whiskey-soaked, gravelly, raspy voice, Rod Stewart; you know, using your voice like an effect, Steven Tyler, you know, the way he, these different sounds in his voice. For the women, Janis Joplin, you know, the raspy voice. So, all right, now, heavy metal. This got a little bit trickier because it was hard for me. The first one that came to my mind was easy. Rob Halford. Rob Halford added techniques, sound to his voice that became synonymous with heavy metal. And that is having a huge range and that upper range. And Rob, for me, has three voices. He has the lower mid-range voice, like in Breaking the Law, there I was come, and then the middle upper range, you don't know what it's, that voice, and then the super high, and I'm not going to imitate this, Painkiller, screaming beyond the realms of death thing, way up high, you know. And the difference between him and, let's say, Ian Gillan is Ian Gillan had those high shrieks way up high, but he wasn't really singing words and singing melodies up there. It was more like he would, you know, maybe like in Child in Time, he would sort of move it around a little bit. But Halford was actually singing verses, you know, way up in that shrieky high range. Think of Painkiller. The whole song is basically like up in that range. So after Rob Halford, that became a thing in heavy metal singing where you had to have these techniques. You had to have your full range. You had to be able to control your shrieks and your screams up high and use that upper range of your voice. The other guy that I would put here is Ronnie James Dio. Ronnie, I would put him sort of in the same category as Freddy Mercury. He's sort of the heavy metal Freddy Mercury, if you will. He brought sort of this, okay, guys were started singing high. You got your singers in metal who have high, clean voices. You think of Rob Halford. And Dio has a high voice, but he has a super thick, powerful, full, operatic, at times sounding, dramatic sounding voice. And so Dio, for me, brings the dramatic, husky, big sounding singing voice. A lot of people don't realize how high of a voice Ronnie James Dio has. I'll often hear people say that Ozzy sang higher than Ronnie. He didn't, not really by even a mile. Ronnie sings way higher than Ozzy, but Ronnie's voice was very dark, thick, heavy. He added some gravel to it in his certain registers. And so for me, Ronnie brings that more darker, thick, menacing, but still big range voice style technique to heavy metal singing. And then the other one that I came up with was Jeff Tate. And Jeff Tate sort of follows off of Ronnie James Dio, but in a different way. And again, maybe I could tie Jeff Tate a little bit into Freddie Mercury too. Jeff Tate was the full-blown operatic thing. Clean voice, super high register, way high, way low, sings with the big falsetto and the big dramatic, but super clean, bright, pingy, projecting voice. In fact, the whole power metal subgenre for me is like practically every singer in power metal is influenced by the techniques of Jeff Tate. All right, so that's what I came up with for heavy metal. I could have also included some growlers and the people who sang with raspier type of voices. You know, maybe you'd say James Hetfield is a guy with his bark style vocals that changed the way, from a technique standpoint, the way people sang. So I'd say James Hetfield and maybe Kronos from Venom, that same type of barky type sound. They might be two guys that brought that technique. I didn't research that one quite as much, so I'm really kind of ending this video with the more cleaner style of singing. I'm not getting into the extreme styles of singing, the barking, growling, screamo type things. I'm not going to touch on those. I'm going to stick with just straight hard rock and sort of classic sounding metal voices. So, all right, so there you go. Let me know in the comments who you think are, let me know what you think of the people that I picked and who you think are the game-changing, technique-changing singers. Singers, remember, this isn't just, this guy's a great singer, because again, there's a lot of great singers that I left off of the list here. Bruce Dickinson, for instance. You know, again, I'm not quite sure what, from a technique standpoint, how Bruce changed the way people sang. Love Bruce Dickinson, amazing vocalist, but I'm not sure if he fits in this sort of specific category that I'm thinking of. Maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments why you think he was a game-changing type of singer. So let me know in the comments who you think some of these singers are who fit into this box here, this description. You know, and again, going back to the metal singers, these guys all brought techniques that have become synonymous with metal singing. Rob's screams, Jeff Tate's operatic voice, Ronnie James Dio's husky, thick voice. So, all right, let me know in the comments who you think fits this description. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. And until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.